when she came to the high school where I teach as a brand new baby author. Hold Still had just come out. It was brand new out in paperback, and we had her for, were you there for 2 days, or was it?
It was longer.
Was it really?
Yeah, I think it was, I mean, I don't know, it felt like an eternity.
Well, we definitely made an impact on each other.
Yes,
I picked Nina up from the airport because I only live 10 minutes from the airport, and you got in the car, and then we didn't stop talking for 24 hours.
That's true.
Yes.
It was a great honor. It was a wonderful program that Nicole's school ran, and it was a testament to librarians and English teachers, how they chose the book to really suit a need in their community and kind of were able to, I don't know, sidestep some really discriminatory policies in order to bring me. And it was just a very, I say an eternity because it was like incredibly, it was exhausting, but it was also incredibly meaningful and like really showed me how much it can mean to be a children's author and like to provide books for teenagers who really need them. So thank you again. Many years ago.
Many years ago, yes. And so I was your In Conversation at Champlain Park that night in 2011. And so it's so lovely to be 11 years later, right? Together again. And since then, there have been babies and books for both of us. But one thing that has been here the whole time is Yerba Buena.
It's true.
So would you start off by pitching the book for us and then tell us a little bit about the history of writing it? And I'm sorry, it always takes me like 20 minutes to pitch my book, so I'm like, there was this guy.
Yeah, you would think I was better at this by this point in my career, but all right, I will try. So Yerba Buena is the story of 2 different women, Sarah and Emily, and it follows their lives from their teen years until they are around 30, and it is about family, being a daughter, being a sibling, wrestling with, like, on the periphery of addictions for people who one loves, and also about finding love and what it takes to kind of identify the self-protective tendencies that we all have from the experiences of our youth, and then to know when it's time to let those go in order to fully love somebody or be able to accept love.
That's beautiful. So you started working on this book back in grad school.
I did, actually before grad school.
Oh, wow, okay.
So I was 21, I think, and I had this idea of the character of Sarah first, and she just kind of came to me, actually, ironically, in New York, because the book takes place completely in California. But I went to New York City for the first time with my then girlfriend, now wife, and we went into a cafe in Brooklyn, and suddenly this character just appeared to me, and I knew she had a brother, and I knew she was running from something. I knew she felt a lot of guilt about leaving her sibling behind. And I kept exploring her for a long time, and then it's what I used to get into grad school.
Oh wow, I didn't realize that part.
Yeah.
So then at what point did you set aside Yerba Buena, and then at what point did you pick it back up again?
I set it aside when I discovered YA literature. So I was in graduate school. I took a class on adolescent literature. I hadn't read much YA. When I was a teenager, I was one of the kids who like skip from children's novels to adult novels, and I think especially at that time there just wasn't YA the way that there is now. And so I first read YA really, with a few exceptions. I first read a bunch of YA novels in I think it was my second semester of grad school, and I just fell in love with it, and I started writing what became my first novel, Hold Still, in that class. And once I started writing that, it just felt like the right thing for me to be writing at the time, and I just kept going and set this aside. And I turn to it now and then in between projects or when other projects weren't going well, but it became very difficult for me to access it because like all of this time would pass and I would become a different kind of writer, and I would look through all of these manuscript pages that felt unfamiliar to me because I had written them so many years ago and I didn't know how to get back in, so it just sat there for a long time.
But then, it was Alana, right? Wasn't she the one that said you needed to actually write the book?
Maybe, but Alana, was it you who said I needed to?
I don't know if I did. Probably not, no.
Alana and I decided, like, we both had projects we wanted to do, and we cheered each other on, and shared a lot of work back and forth. And it's so motivating to have somebody who you're writing alongside with and who's excited to read what you're writing. And so that was a very wonderful gift.
So I got to be an early reader of Yerba Buena, and one of my very favorite things, I was just saying to you before the event, was, like reading an early version and then seeing what changed, right, in this finished copy. And so one of the things that I noticed was, originally we got Sarah's story for a solid 50 pages or more before we meet Emily. Mm-hmm. And then now we get Emily's story much sooner. So could you talk maybe some about the challenges of writing the dual POV? At what point did you decide, or did your editor help you decide that we needed to meet Emily earlier? Because this is your first, I know when you wrote the book with David Levithan, it was a dual point of view, but you were writing one and he was writing the other. So, yes. If memory serves me right, this is your first dual POV
It is,
book.
yes. Actually, I thought that my book, Everything Leads to You, was going to be dual POV, and then I scrapped that. So this is the first one that ended up being that way. I really struggled with the structure of this book, and it was one of the real reasons that it took me so long to write. I just couldn't figure it out. It was something I wanted to have. I wanted to be able to make sense of the narrative, and I wanted to be able to know what I was doing, because that's where I feel most comfortable in my writing, but I wasn't able to do that. And I finally had to just let go of the need to have everything mapped out and perfect in my mind before starting, and to just dive in and write it. And so originally I had an 80-page section, I think, that was all Sarah, the first character. But then I just found that it would be so jarring to go from that to the next character, and it just didn't feel quite right. And so it was a very last, a very kind of final round, not final round, but late in the drafting process, to have the first section where we meet Sarah and then we meet Emily, and then we continue forward with Sarah's story before switching again. Because I also wanted to give the sense that they were going to meet, and that so that people weren't wondering forever, why are we reading these two stories?
Well, and I remember you having an epiphany, right? You were really struggling with this book, and then I remember you said, oh my gosh, it's a sibling story. I thought it was a love story, but it's not. It's a sibling story. And then later on, you were like, no, it's a love story. So I want to first talk about the sibling story, and then I want to talk about, we'll get to that part second. So I want to, do you want to read that part first, and then I'll just read the little Emily part?
Sure.
Or should I read the little Emily part first?
Let's read this one first,
yeah,
so people don't forget the Emily.
Okay.
Does that sound good?
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, good call. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to read just an incredibly sad part for you.
Oh, wait, I'm sorry. I have to tell you this metaphor before you do that. Oh. So when I talk about Nina and my relationship, I'm using water metaphors. Nina is a canoe, and she glides from sad, beautiful place to sad, beautiful place. And I am a golden retriever leaping off a dock chasing a tennis ball. Yes, so let's hear your sad, beautiful thing, Nina.
I really love dogs. I really love
and I love sad, beautiful things, so.
All right, so this is a scene where, so I mentioned early on I knew this character Sarah, and I knew that she was going to leave her brother, and I knew it would be awful, but I didn't know how we would get there. So I'm skipping over how we got there, but I'm reading the scene where she leaves her brother. So there's not much you need to know. You won't know everything, but that's okay. It's only 30 pages into the book, so you can catch up. And all you need to know is that Sarah has been a mother figure to her brother Spencer. All right. All that mattered was the money in her pocket and the car that ran again in Grant, driving quickly enough for her to catch Spencer on his ride from school to his friend Henry's house, where he went every afternoon. And here they were in the distance, two boys pedaling up the street. Pull over, she told Grant, and leaned out the window to call Spencer's name. He heard her, stopped writing. She meant to open her door and get out, but found that she couldn't, her palms suddenly sweaty, a knot in her throat. She could see Spencer trying to make sense of Grant as he walked his bike to her window while Henry stayed up ahead. I need to talk to you, she said. Okay. When she didn't move or say anything else, he opened her door and she stepped out. We have to go. Where? Los Angeles. He smiled, and relief pulsed through her until he said, ha, funny. I'm not joking, she said. She didn't want to say the words, but she had to tell him something. They found Annie. She tried to breathe. She saw that he understood. I can't go back home. He nodded. But we don't have money. I got some. I have enough for a little while. Where would we even live? We'll figure it out. What about Dad? What about Dad? Sarah. Spencer. There is nothing for us here. Please. Her hands were shaking. She tried to still them but couldn't, so she hid them behind her back. Spencer, please, just get in the car. He looked at his handlebars. He touched the bell with his thumb gently, and it chimed so quietly she could barely hear it. He did it again and again, over and over, as the minutes stretched by, and then another. What was happening? All those meals she had cooked for him, all the times she tucked him in and kissed his forehead and said, I love you. But he wasn't saying yes. He wasn't coming with her. Okay, she finally said. A sob rose in her throat, but she turned to the concrete and forced it away. I'll call you when I get there. As soon as I have a phone number, I'll give it to you. Ask Henry's mom to let you stay at their house for dinner every night, okay? And go to her if you need anything, ever. Spencer nodded, but she could see that he didn't understand. Stay away from Eugene, she said. Do you hear me? Why? Just promise me. Okay? Promise me. I promise. But she could tell he didn't know what was happening, and she barely did either, only that she couldn't stay. She didn't want him to see her cry, but how could she help it? She had known he would go with her, and now he wasn't. She had known she would never leave him, and now she was. She held him against her as her chest heaved, and then she folded herself back into the car, managed to shut the door. Grant started the engine, pulled onto the road, and Spencer stood watching her, eyebrows furrowed, as they passed him and went on. It would be hard to have a kid with you, Grant said. Probably better this way.
So in both situations, right, there is a strong sibling connection, right? Sarah and Spencer have this very strong connection at the beginning of the book, and then we also see Emily and her sister. And Emily's sister suffers from various forms of substance abuse. And at one point I wrote this description where Emily was grateful for her shabby apartment, quote, as though the nail holes on the walls, the streaky paint on the ceiling, the worn fabric on the sofa might soften the terrible feeling she'd overtaken her sister. And one of the things I've learned from you as a writer is how important setting is. And I used to just sort of like think about it as like, it's this place where the things happen. But more and more, I of course, like setting is a character, right? And so this was just one of those beautiful places where we see the reflection of the relationship in the setting, right? So will you just talk a little bit about sort of the things you were thinking with those two sibling pairs, the ways that they were similar, the ways that they were different?
Yeah. So, for Sarah, she has this kind of parental role with Spencer, and setting is very important in that too. Like one of the earliest moments that you see them together, she's like in their kitchen and she's making him breakfast, and it's this routine that they do all the time, very like rooted in their home. And then with Emily and her sister, Emily's sister Colette is a little bit older than she is, and Emily really idolizes her, and it's very early in the novel that we see kind of the beginning of trouble in their relationship. And I think both of the characters really have to struggle kind of against these roles. So Sarah has to struggle against the role of being the caretaker older sister, and kind of forgive herself for not being able to be a parent when she was just a kid too. And Emily has to struggle to live her own life and move on and not worry about her sister so much, like trust that her sister can take care of herself and that she shouldn't make herself small in order to preserve this idea of what her sister is to her.
And they're both, these riveting relationships that we see with both pairing. And so I can see why at one point you were like, haha, this is it. And then you realized that it was, it was a love story. And so how do you how do you discover what a book is trying to be?
Just through writing it, really. As much I try, I always want to know. I'm very much someone, I want to know how it will be structured. I want to know what it's about. I want to know all of it. And then I realize I just have to surrender to the process, and I have to write the book and drafts of the book and figure out what was going to become kind of the heart of it, or the glue. And this one was really tough for me to figure out because it is a love story. It's not a romance. That's something that's been interesting about the reception. I think maybe the jacket copy might contribute to making people think that it's going to be a more traditional romance, and so they want much more time with the characters together. But it's really a dual kind of coming into adulthood story, and with some love in there. And so I was, I don't know, it was a big struggle. It was a big puzzle, but I kept making notes. And even like earlier today, I was writing and I had an epiphany about some, theme in my book, and maybe it's about this, and it feels so good for a couple of minutes to know what your book is about.
For a couple minutes.
Yes, and then it will go away.
Another challenge, you just gave yourself a lot of challenges with this book. There's a non-linear timeline as well. So you have done that, you've gone back and forth. We Are Okay, it goes back and forth. We see two different timelines. But there's sort of like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but they, there's one and then there's the other, and they're sort of both told in order. But this is not doing that. So, will you,
Yeah. Well, yes, it was very. That was the question I was asking myself. So, like for Sarah, there's a huge part of her story that takes place when she's a teenager in a very compressed period of time. For Emily, it's a much more drawn out time. Like things are more evenly distributed over the course of the years, and so that was a challenge. That I had to figure out, and then also there were moments that were very important for each character, and I wanted to be able to be in their perspective for that same moment, but I didn't want to do the thing where you do the exact same scene, like again. I didn't want to set myself up for that structure because I knew that's not what I was trying to do. So I just allowed myself to be like super fluid in the storytelling and just hoped people would just like ride along with me.
I think we do. I absolutely. I think we do. It's great. It's great fun, and I was just. It's just a very impressive timeline that works. It's complicated, and I really think that it works. Another theme of this book is passing, and Emily's story in particular, like what this means for her in the world. And so you've got a section on page 154. Would you read us that a little bit?
Yes, I would. Okay. So this is Emily and Sarah, like a snippet of one of their first conversations. All right, let's see. Okay, well, they're talking about the novel Passing by Nella Larson, but I'm not going to read this whole part. So, all right, so this is Emily's perspective. She turns back to the book in her hands. It was an edition she hadn't seen before, the title in bold red, pencil drawings beneath. She thought of how she'd stayed up all night writing her paper after the trip to the canyon, all the meaning she found in its pages when her life had felt empty. She wanted to know what it meant to Sarah. What's it about to you? Sarah leaned back. I guess how they both come from the same place but end up with completely different lives, just based on their choices. It's fascinating. You? I think it's like when you're a passing person, other people believe what they want to about you, whatever is easier or better for them. They see what they want to in you. So if you don't really know what you want, or if you know what you want but it's bad for you, you can veer off in the wrong direction. Emily closed the book, set it back on its shelf. But if you do know, then I guess you have a lot of freedom.
I love that part. Can you talk a little bit about the inspiration for that, for Passing, for that concept in this book for you?
Yeah. Well, on my dad's side of the family, I'm Creole, so my grandparents' journey kind of is very represented in this book in a lot of different ways. Some very literally, like actual love letters from my grandfather to my grandmother, like ended up in the book.
Oh, I love that.
And their homes and where they lived in LA and everything. But it's just something that has been very interesting to me as a writer to have this like part of my identity that is complex for me and that felt too complex to put in a book. And so in most of my books, I kind of just defaulted to white narrators and white characters because I was like, oh, well, it's such a complex identity. I don't know where I fit. I don't know. So I didn't want to discuss it because I felt like it wasn't the point of the book, which I also think is like a craft issue, as Anne Ursu would probably say. Oh, yeah, there you are. Oh, no, you're not there. Anyway, you're somewhere. I know you're here. But I think like it has taken me a while to figure out like how can all of the complexities of my identity fit into a story, and when do I want to spend time on this and when do I not? And this book and Emily's character really gave me time to ruminate on all of these things and to explore them, which was just very exciting and felt like incredibly fertile for me to be able to pour all of that into a book. And my next book also is about a family like my own on my dad's side, and I'm getting even deeper into that stuff, and it's been really fun.
And so how does it feel? Like, how do you feel now having that in a book and claiming that?
I feel great. Yeah, it feels good.
Yay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yes. Yay. So there's just three little things left. There's one point when Emily says to her friend Carlos, she goes to Carlos's art installation, and she sees this, piece of art that she thinks is about her, and she thinks is this like huge, like he's just betrayed her, right? And realizes it's not about her, it's about him. And she says to him, it's like the best possible thing art can do. It's about you, but I see myself in it. I imagine everyone here does. And I had to put the book down. Like I sat and I just, absolutely. I mean, there's just these moments where you talk about passing, where you talk about art, there's all these moments where I just have to sit back and so I just, way to go. Like that's beautiful. Way to go, it's beautiful. And we can't leave without talking about the title. Yeah, so Yerba Buena, the good herb, right? My children go to Spanish immersion school, and so my Eliza, who's 13, saw this sitting on the counter, and she said, the good herb? Like, she was like, subtext, what a weird name for a book. 13.
Tells it like it is.
Yeah, she does, 13. But it's the good herb. It's both bitter and sweet. So, I always ask, and some of you have been to your book events, and the question I always ask is, how do you come up with titles? And I remember that was the first time I ever met Elliot Treffer. I asked him, how do you come up with titles? And he was like, I write beautiful, poetic titles, and then my editor says, we're calling it the Rainforest Book. So, tell me about, it's perfect, right? This book is bitter, and it's sweet. Talk to me about Yerba Buena.
Okay. Well, actually, it's funny. I got the most thoughtful gift from a reader whose her family is from Mexico, and she lives in Northern California, like I do. She drove very far, like a 3-hour, 4-hour drive to come to one of my book events, and she brought me a pot of Yerba Buena. That's her like generational, like ancestral Yerba Buena. Like her grandmother took this from her home in Mexico, and they moved. And they were farm workers, and they moved them from like place to place, and now they are very settled in the Sacramento area, and it's like growing all over. And she brought some to me, just so kind and beautiful. And my daughter took one and ate it because she eats mint all the time, but hadn't had like actual Yerba Buena. And she goes, "This is a very savory mint." Also really enjoy.
I like that. Yeah.
So, the Yerba Buena plays different roles in the book. It's the name of a restaurant, so that's a very central restaurant for both of the characters' journeys. And it also, is a plant that grows out of the ground, and both characters interact with it in a way early on before they know each other. And I liked using it in that way to also hint at these connections. And then it's a native Californian herb, and both of these characters are very much like products of where they are from, and very influenced by where they are from. And so I liked the idea of something that is part of the earth and life. I don't know. There was something that's kind of amorphous, but there was something I liked about it. But I also recently I was sitting in for a book club who read this book, and someone I wish I had written down what she said, because she explained it and said, she was like, is it called Yerba Buena because, and then she goes into this completely eloquent and I was like, no, but yes. But now I've forgotten.
Was it early though? Early on, did did you know that this is what this book was called?
It was only when I sat down to, well, I guess I knew it like within the last 5 years, but probably not before then.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't have a title for it.
Did you just call it Sarah? I'm always so interested, like working titles.
Like for a long time it was called Salvage, because there is like home renovation in it, but at one point it was like very central, like the most, like the setting was the whole time this home that was being renovated. So I called it that because they were like salvaging what they could, but it just like, I didn't want that anymore.
That's beautiful. Well, there is a sort of like a fun, I don't know, a fun thing about this book, and here we go. So Emily, right? The narration says she had collections of gemstones and shells and books with green spines. And then someone says, "Do you read them?" And Emily says, "Of course." He laughed. "Are green books better?" "Not better, just prettier," she said. "I read all books. I just keep the green ones."
Yeah.
They did a good job. I was very pleased that I made that choice.
Right, and I mean, there's so much green, like there's so much green imagery in the book, but like the first time I read it, it was a Word document, you know, so this was like a, delight, what a delight, what a delight. Is there anything that you want people to know? Like, is there like a takeaway when people set down this book you really hope they...
Well, I'm gonna, like, you were like, is there anything that you want people to know? And I was like, I want you to know that Nicole Kronzer is a wonderful author. Her novel, Unscripted, is so good. When we order her next book, The Roof Above Our Heads, she has swag. Alana Kate Arnold blurbed her book.
That's true.
And it's just, they're so good and wonderful. And thank you so much for all of your thoughtful questions.
Thank you, Nina.
Okay, to answer your question. It meant a lot to me that how you described the feeling of reading that part after the art gallery scene, and that is my, like, if I have a goal in writing, it is to do that. Like, it is to write something that feels personal to everybody in some way and try to capture some universality of human experience. And so I hope that people do, just feel seen in some way, or feel just less alone in some way, and maybe more hopeful, even though there are very sad things that happen in the book and are kind of left unresolved. There's still a lot of beauty and hope in the book, and the characters really, they form these lives for themselves that they crave, which I think is pretty powerful. Like, we all have the ability to do things for ourselves in our own lives to make them better and more meaningful, and so that's what I hope.
I love it. All right. Okay, so we have time for a Q&A. Who has Q's? Nina has A's. Okay. I think we can do the thing where you say the thing and then I repeat it into the microphone.
Sure.
Should we do that? Okay.
So I love the book. It's so wonderful. And I've had a hard couple of years reading, and it was one of the few books in the last couple of years that I really just kind of fell into and gulped it in a day. It was really magical. So thank you for that. But what I'm curious about is I've never written a dual point of view. And I found myself like, I guess what I want to ask is, who do you love more? But what I mean is, like, it's hard to inhabit more than one character in that way you do a main character. And I just found myself wondering, like, something about the process of it. Like, did you live with one of them and then set them aside and then go live with, like, how does that all work?
So the question for those in the back, in case you didn't hear, right? There's the two points of view. So the first question is, who do you love more? And then sorry, say that part again, Laurel.
Like, how do you inhabit two different characters? Like, what is the process of writing one?
How do you inhabit two different characters in the process? What is that like?
I mean, it was very slow. Like, I lived with them for so long. I mean, I'm about to turn 40. I lived with these characters since I was 21. Like, so they, even though I had no idea what their stories would be or how I would write this book or if I would ever write this book or finish it, they did live in me for a long time. I jumped around when writing them, as I always do in all of my work. I jump around constantly. It was nice because it gave me two different worlds to jump around in and explore. It was difficult sometimes because Sarah's story, like, a lot more big stuff happens. Emily's story is so much more kind of like interior, internal. And so I felt a lot of worry about trying to balance them and like wondering if like it's actually, I mean, it's cool in a like creative writing sense because it's like how can I make like a cutting remark from a sister feel like as painful as like a really like saying goodbye to your brother when he has to go back home again when he only first got him back, like how can I make these things feel emotionally I mean not exactly equivalent but like weighty enough. Like if you're in this, like if you're in the Sarah parts and there's so much going on and there's such high stakes, and then you're in the Emily parts where the stakes are lower, but like emotionally they aren't for her. You know, how does that work? And so it was totally a challenge, but I don't know. It was a good, I like challenges.
Do you have a favorite?
I don't have a favorite, no. Though people seem to have very clear favorites. Like rarely do I meet someone, well, I mean, some people have been like, I love them both, but most people have like one that they're gravitating toward, which I think is pretty normal. I wish people liked them equally. But they don't.
Other questions? Elliot.
You just gave an excellent lecture on atmosphere for the MFA residency at Hamlet. And you said one way of thinking about it is a sentence, an atmosphere of blank with blank and blank.
And now Elliot is going to answer. Now Elliot is going to describe Yerba Buena in one sentence.
How would you describe Yerba Buena?
So how can you describe your book in one sentence? An atmosphere of blank and blank and blank.
Oh, did someone do it for me or no? I'm going to say an atmosphere of beauty with pain and determination.
All right.
Questions?
Oh, over here.
Great.
Hi. I was wondering how it is that you not just maintain your enthusiasm for a project that stretches on as long as the writing of this book sounds like it did, but how you balance the dichotomy and discomfort of like having to put what has been in your head for 7 or 8 years onto the page and knowing that it's not quite going to measure up.
So how do you maintain enthusiasm for a long project, something that's 20 years, and then how do you, say the second part again. Clearly I'm only capable of remembering one part of the question.
That's okay. Just how do you balance that dichotomy of knowing that what's been in your head for a long time is not going to look the way you want it to when you first put it out?
Okay, and how do you balance the dichotomy of understanding that the thing in your head that's been in your head isn't going to look the way that you would think it should look, right? Which is like a common problem of art, quite frankly. Yeah,
for sure. Well, I let almost everything go when I started writing this one. So like when I started again during the pandemic, like during the like shelter in place, we were not going anywhere time. And I basically started like a page 1 rewrite. I hardly kept anything. So I had those pages, but I found that looking at those pages really helped me back and I would just spend time like reading and rereading and not knowing what to do and then feeling lost and giving up. And so I realized I just had to like look at them, set them aside, and start over, which was incredibly, that was so difficult because I had a whole bunch of pages and scenes, but I did not use them. And then it was actually kind of nice because, like I said, I did not use them, but there were then like some conversations that my characters were having, and I was like, oh wait, like I wrote this, I think, and I could go back and I could look and take like a line or two. It was kind of like a nice little treat when that happened. But it was really like I started with a blank document, and then because the answer was I couldn't do it. And then I mean, it's just like they so rarely like live up to what you hope, and so sometimes, like I think in the best times, it's like you're exploring and you're discovering as you go, and maybe you aren't writing to a ideal, like you're not writing toward an ideal, you're just writing with like the feeling of discovery and exploration. And so I think that's like a mindset shift that I try. Like I'm going to write to discover, I'm going to write to explore. I'm not trying to capture like this one thing, this like ideal in my mind. I'm just going to see what I can find. And that has helped me a lot over the years. Yeah.
right to discover, right to explore. I like that a lot. Other questions? Yes.
I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. So both characters kind of are very talented, but it seems like they both have different relationships to their art or occupation. Where Emily, it's more easy and natural, where Sarah feels complicated towards it. I'm curious about that decision.
So, okay, Sarah and Emily they're both very competent at their jobs, but they have different relationships with the kind of work they do. It seems to come easier to Emily, and Sarah, it's more complicated. Can you talk about that? Is that good?
Yeah, so Sarah has a number of passions throughout the book. She arranges flowers and does a bunch of things, and then ends up restoring homes.
Emily.
Oh, I'm sorry, Emily. Thank you. And it's a very I don't want to give away too much, but it's a very kind of it's a path that feels very right. It's a path that she finds herself on because of turning back to her family and her history and feeling like she's honoring her grandparents in this way. Sarah, on the other hand, she's a bartender, and she is a famous kind of mysterious, secretive, Los Angeles bartender, very sexy and cool, and so hers she doesn't question at all in the beginning, but she does have a lot of addiction in her family, and she goes back to where she's from, and she has kind of a crisis because she's what am I doing, am I she finds it to be an art form, but she feels it's more complicated for her because alcohol is complicated for a lot of people. And she ends up coming up with an answer that feels right for her, but it is a crisis that she has. And that was me also going through being I set up this situation that's very complicated, and not consciously at first, and then instead of being oh gosh, I really messed up, instead how would a character face this? What would she go through? And so then I had to work through it with her.
Other questions? Yes.
If someone's struggling through a book hangover after your book,
Oh my
Okay,
gosh.
so if someone's struggling, actually, somebody just emailed me this today about your book. If someone's struggling with a book hangover after Yerba Buena, what do you recommend?
I love this question. Well, there's a book that came out just a couple months before that I really love by an author called Michelle Hart. It's a debut adult novel called We Do What We Do in the Dark, and I really love it. So I would recommend that.
I'm writing it down.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah, Ingrid.
Do you think you're gonna write more young adult books in the future, or more adult books, or what audience do you see yourself going forward?
Question is, are you going to write more young adult books, or going to write more adult books? Who is your future audience, Nina LaCour?
Everybody. So I have a picture book called Mama and Mommy and Me in the Middle that just came out, and I have a chapter book series coming out, and I'm working on a second adult novel right now, and I have another YA that's on an old contract that is very late. So I'm doing it all. I'm working on it all.
Yes, Erin.
How do you balance all of that?
And the question is, how do you balance all of that?
By being very late. I don't know. It's hard, but it's really nice. It's we'll finish a kind of novel that feels big and arduous and difficult, and then I'll get to completely shift tone and age and audience, and that feels just very fun, and it's it's using a different part of my brain. I get to show a different part of my personality through it. It's I do have a lot of, I am kind of a sad canoe. But also,
Beautiful. There's also beautiful.
But also, I like to be silly, so it's very, very fun to be able to, move around and stuff like that. And, the hardest parts are, when I have deadlines and I feel like writing the other thing, that's very challenging, but I just push through it.
Yeah, go follow up, Erin.
So are you writing one at a time, or are you ever working on them simultaneously?
So the question is, are you writing one at a time, or are you working on projects simultaneously?
Usually it ends up like I never write just like a novel from beginning to end without working on the other thing, or I haven't since I was exclusively doing my YA novels. Now I jump around a lot because I, with multiple contracts, I'm just moving around or with a new idea, or something I would like to do. So, so I find myself moving around quite a bit. But in my ideal world, it's like I can finish a draft and then while I'm waiting for my editor's feedback, I can do another project and then kind of have these like nice breaking points, or even like finish like a first part of a book and then set it aside for a little bit. Yes.
What is your process like about writing secondary characters that are relative to the main ones, and how do you process through going overboard and just like writing incredibly about characters like Spencer in relativity to Sarah?
This is such a good question. How do you write secondary characters without going overboard, right? Like, you just want to tell us everything about Spencer, but you can't because he's a secondary character. Yeah?
Yeah. It's such a good question. I mean, I find that, like, I'm fairly slow in my writing, in my drafting, and so I rarely get, like, swept up and carried away, for better or worse. Like, I love it when I feel that way, but it's very rare. So that means, like, I'm pretty intentional with the things that I write. So if I felt, like, a pull towards Spencer and I wanted to explore him more, but I knew, like, that was not going to make it. Like, I know what Spencer's role in the story is, and so I'm not going to delve way into his interests because that's just not, like, it's not right for the story because, like, he's only there for a short time in the beginning, and then when he comes back, Sarah doesn't know all of his interests, and it's through her point of view, and it's like, and their relationship is strained, and he's not going to tell her these things that he's very excited about. That it's going to be quiet and uncomfortable, So that kind of like, just kind of staying focused on what I know the story needs helps me with that. But your question really makes me think about my first book, Hold Still, because I have this side character named Dylan, who I loved, who was so fun to write. Like, whenever Dylan showed up, I just wanted to write more and more about her. She was so much more, like, dynamic than my main character, Caitlin. And I just, like, I wanted to just, like, run away with her sometimes. And I couldn't, because it was Caitlin's story, but it has made me think so much about why sometimes we have these very compelling secondary characters. And like, I think that we get to have these, like, super dynamic kind of, like, scene stealer characters sometimes because we only get them in small bits. And, like, if that was the main character, like, there wouldn't, like, for many reasons, that just isn't the journey that's not the story that I'm wanting to tell. So, like, our more, our less flashy main characters sometimes is what, like, enables us to tell this, like, really satisfying arc without getting so distracted by, like, the voiciness or the quirks or whatever it is. Not that your main characters can't have voiciness and quirks, but, like, it's just, secondary characters, like, they serve a very specific function. And so I try to keep that in my mind.
That's a great question. Other questions for Nina LaCour? We have one more. Annie is telling me one more question. Alana K. Arnold.
Nina LaCour, I've heard it said you're a poem of a person.
Oh, I heard that too.
Can you tell us what that's like?
So, Alana K. Arnold says, Nina LaCour, I have heard you called a poem of a person. Can you tell us what that's like?
It means I have very lovely friends who say very nice things about me. Thank you very much to you and everyone for coming. And thank you so much, Nicole, for your questions.
Well, thank you for asking me, Nina. This has been an absolute pleasure. So, put your hands together for Nina LaCour.